1945, and as the most tumultuous conflict in human history marches towards its climax, the Axis powers that had spread so much destruction upon the world are being pummeled under the weight of immense Allied air power, blasting the path ahead of the advancing armies. Indeed, it was air power that had defined the conflict and shaped it, becoming the key to ultimate victory. More aircraft were built and aircrew trained to operate them than ever before in human history, and the technology had developed at a rapid rate. The fastest warplanes at the start of the war, for example, could just about scrape 300 miles an hour. But as the war was coming to an end, aircraft were routinely pushing 500 miles an hour, and in some cases, with the advent of the jet engine, even faster than that. But while the Allies' own aircraft development was logical and incremental, with each new version of a specific fighter or bomber building on the previous one's traits and addressing its faults, German development of flight in this period, by comparison, was meteoric, always trying to leapfrog the Allies, so that their performance counterbalanced the Allies' numerical superiority. This resulted in a plethora of truly extraordinary aircraft, birthed from the twisted minds of Nazi science. Arado AR-234 jet bombers, Me-163 Comet rocket-powered fighters, Me-262 jet fighters, and even V-1 cruise and V-2 ballistic missiles. While their technology was still yet to be fully mature, the Nazi forces still embraced them, seeking every possible advantage to turn the tide of the war. It was against this backdrop of bizarre weapons seemingly pulled from a Flash Gordon serial being hurled against them that the Allied intelligence agents trawled through countless reports from their pilots of anything unusual, hoping to identify the latest Wunderwaffe or wonder weapon. While many of these reports were attributed to misidentification on the part of Allied pilots, very quickly astute intelligence officers began to notice a pattern of sightings of strange, often luminous objects trailing behind Allied aircraft, performing extraordinary feats of flight, although never really proving a threat. They began to suspect that these were failed tests of new weapons, and so when the war ended, they were eager to interview German pilots and scientists who were now their prisoners. To their amazement, however, the Germans were just as puzzled by these sightings as the Allied airmen were, who had come to give them the nonsensical nickname of Foo Fighters. The Foo Fighter phenomenon has become firmly embedded in so-called UFO lore, but rather uniquely, no one has ever come out and dismissed the sightings. Instead, it being generally agreed that pilots on both sides were seeing something, but it isn't agreed on exactly what, and debate still rages today. It is perhaps thanks to this debate that the stories of Foo Fighters have overshadowed sightings made even earlier in the annals of military aviation history, in fact at its very birth. The Great War, the First World War, had its own stories of Foo Fighters. Again, set against the paranoid backdrop of technology advancingly seemingly out of control. The Airship Scare, or Scareship phenomenon, became a very real menace to the Allied powers in the years leading up to and during the First World War, as the fear of German airship technology conjured up images of cities destroyed from the air, Allied defenses being powerless to stop them. However, was this just mass hysteria as is generally accepted? As we celebrate the month of October, in association with our UFO-themed sister channel, Destination Declassified, we are going to examine how a world gripped with fear began seeing mysterious airships and aircraft in the sky, whether they were really there or not, and how one of Britain's most celebrated figures was left egg-faced to explain them. Welcome to Wars of the World. October 1912. Naval investigators from Sheerness, then a major port for the Royal Navy based in North Kent, England, trudged their way around the shops and businesses that sat in the facility's orbit. Speaking to shop owners, clerks, delivery boys, and random people on the street, they asked questions about the evening of October 14th and obviously took what people had to say quite seriously. Summing up this specific event they were interested in was the report given by a woman working as an ironmonger. As the investigator noted, quote, "She saw a light over Sheerness, westward from the shore. The light seemed bright and was moving eastwards fairly fast. She was unable to give any estimate of height. The night was dark, but the light enabled her to have the impression of seeing a long, dark object. She heard the sound of an engine." End quote. Other witnesses to this bizarre event included a naval lieutenant who, believing a British aircraft of some type was trying to find somewhere to land, contacted Eastchurch Naval Aerodrome, which lit flares hoping to guide the aircraft in. But instead, it simply flew ominously overhead before disappearing into the night. The perplexed personnel at Eastchurch couldn't understand why the aircraft had ignored their beacons, until they began to suspect that it wasn't British, which led to the aerodrome's commandant to contact the British Admiralty in London, declaring that in his opinion, a German Zeppelin, one of the Kaiser's mighty airships, had either conducted a nocturnal reconnaissance of the defences along the English coast, or even inserted enemy saboteurs into the countryside, the light being used for navigation or to illuminate points of interest. The Admiralty fumbled about in their response to this incident, until on November 27th, the First Lord of the Admiralty faced a barrage of questions regarding the incident. That person being none other than Winston Spencer Churchill, the future Prime Minister. Present journalists noted that despite his usual bluster, Churchill appeared in this case flummoxed, struggling to find words to lessen the seriousness of the situation as they viewed it at the time. But in the end, he was forced to admit, quote, "It is possible for an unknown airship to circle without interruption or interference of any kind over a British dockyard, and over a harbour containing 50 British warships, both ships and dockyard being alike defenceless against aerial attack." End quote. While of course not being as famous as he would be during Britain's darkest days in 1940, Churchill was nonetheless already a household name in Britain at the time, given the importance that the nation placed on its fleet to protect it from the hostile powers of Europe. Therefore, for him to go on record admitting that an airship, almost certainly a German one, had proven that if so instructed could launch attacks against Britain unopposed, sent shockwaves through the public, who began turning their heads to the skies, envisioning fleets of German Zeppelins blacking out the sun and dropping bombs on their homes. In the months that followed, British authorities were inundated with sightings of German airships up and down the British Isles, and in some cases even further afield within the Empire. Australia, Canada, South Africa, nowhere seemed to be able to escape the menace of the German Zeppelins, who appeared to own the skies. Except for the fact, of course, that 90% of cases would be explained away as misidentification or rumour rather than a direct report. The reality, of course, was that Churchill's words, coupled with the sensationalising of supposed sightings in the press, fueled the minds of a British population already preoccupied with the fear of an attack by Germany, who at that time seemed to be the only nation with the power and technology to threaten Britain's dominance. It was not even the first time that the public had been thrown into such a panic. In the preceding decade, there was a fear that the Imperial German Navy might overtake the Royal Navy in the number of dreadnoughts they possessed. This led to a public outcry for more to be built, leading to the popular slogan, "We want 8 and we won't wait." There was even a brief previous wave of airship sightings, all of which amounted to nothing. However, what of the remaining sightings that couldn't be explained as a case of national anxiety? In these instances, mirroring what would happen later during the Second World War, the immediate response was to declare these as actual incursions by German Zeppelins. At the time, German airships designed and built by Ferdinand von Zeppelin were without doubt the most advanced in the world, and could fly higher and further than the primitive powered aircraft of the day, that in many cases were barely an improvement over the Wright brothers' own revolutionary first heavier-than-air design. It made sense, therefore, to attribute these sightings to them. But in the face of this was von Zeppelin himself, denying that his airships were involved. Nevertheless, the British public continued to see these supposed German airships, and wild speculation in British media about their intentions led to vigilante groups being formed to scour the countryside looking for secret Zeppelin airbases, established ahead of a fully expected surprise attack. This airship panic continued until war did finally break out in 1914, and the British public genuinely did come under attack by German Zeppelins dropping bombs on their heads. The question still remains, however, as to just what was seen in the sky over Sheerness that night, and it remains an enduring mystery of the pre-war era. While the airship panic continued and even enveloped the United States for a time, which remained neutral in the opening years of the war, South Africa would find itself in the grip of a spate of mysterious airplane sightings between August 11th and September 9th, 1914. At the time, aircraft were extremely rare in South Africa, there only being a handful registered in August 1914, and so seeing one tended to attract a lot of attention. The airplanes that were reported across South Africa were both of the mono and biplane types, common of the era, although no exact type identification was ever made. Once again, the blame was placed on Germany, as Southwest Africa was, at the time, under German control. In 1955, writer Edgar Sievers recounted several of these sightings, including an aircraft with a torpedo-shaped fuselage flying over Pretoria, the torpedo shape being common amongst UFO sightings of the 20th century. Shortly after the book was published, Sievers claimed he was contacted by an old farmer from Greytown, Natal, who said that one evening in September 1914 he'd encountered a German aircraft, similar to those he had been reading about in the papers, not in the air, but on the ground. The aircraft was stationary in some grassland not far from where he stood, and he watched as two men, whom the farmer described as German spies, were taking water from a stream with a pail. Many researchers have used the South African sightings in this early war period as a classic example of public hysteria, since there is almost no evidence to back up their claims. For one thing, while aircraft were rare in South Africa, there were a handful being used for training, and it was possible that it was these that were being seen, fear of German technology immediately attributing them to agents of the Kaiser. Given the number of false alarms concerning German airships and aircraft over British and Allied lines, the concern then became that genuine sightings of German airships would be disregarded as such, and therefore become a real threat to national security. Prior to the war, investigations into sightings had been on an ad hoc basis, but following the start of hostilities, a more formal approach was needed to collect and assess reports of strange, possibly hostile aircraft, in order to develop strategies to counter them. Reportedly dubbed Military Observation Department 5, the group was part of the organization that was the precursor of today's MI5 intelligence group, headed by Lieutenant Colonel Vernon Kell, and has often been cited as the first official investigation into UFO sightings in the world. However, again it should be emphasized that this department's mission was to disseminate genuine sightings of German aircraft intruding in British airspace from false claims, rather than investigating any potential extraterrestrials visiting Earth, as sometimes has been claimed in UFO books. Kell's work only grew in importance as German Zeppelins became their very real reign of terror against the British Isles. The fears vocalized in Parliament following the Sheerness sightings in 1912 came true on December 21, 1914, when a German seaplane attempted to bomb Dover, dropping two very light bombs which missed their target and landed in the sea near a pier. Additional seaplane raids were carried out, but on January 7, 1915, Kaiser Wilhelm II authorized his Zeppelins to begin a bombing campaign against Britain. From a practical sense, these raids wouldn't be able to achieve very much damage on the British war effort. However, as German Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz remarked, quote, "The measure of the success will lie not only in the injury which will be caused to the enemy, but also in the significant effect it will have in diminishing the enemy's determination to prosecute the war." End quote. Tirpitz and those who supported him were therefore advocating a campaign of terror bombing. This campaign already being primed due to the British population already being in a state of panic about seeing German airships that weren't really there. Yet. Zeppelins thus became like demons to the British populace, whose fears, birthed by Churchill's admissions 2 years prior, were now manifesting as reality. The advent of genuine Zeppelin sightings allowed British intelligence to develop more of an idea of their performance and tactics, leading to development of weapons to counter them. And yet, sandwiched between the genuine sightings and the cases of misidentifications, there still lay numerous cases that couldn't be easily explained as one or the other. Mysterious lights, seen in the Scottish Highlands at the start of the Zeppelin campaign, were initially attributed to German spies signaling to their comrades. But while these added details turn out to be false, the origins of the lights remain a mystery. Interestingly, while so much of the British paranoia was based on the concept of advanced German technology, on the other side of the front lines in France and Belgium, the Germans themselves were plagued by mysterious goings-on that they attributed to British and French spies. In their case, however, the mysterious lights were assumed to be in relation to cars being driven around the countryside by Allied agents signaling to each other with coloured spotlights or flares, or again to aircraft overhead, or even to British warships sneaking up on the German coast to begin shelling German towns, as the Germans themselves did against Yarmouth on November 3rd, 1914. Such was the concern regarding these mysterious cars and their lights, that several tragedies would occur, whereby innocent people were shot by militia groups or army sentries dispatched to stop suspicious vehicles after unexplained lights had been seen. One of those shot was a 12-year-old girl who died in her mother's arms as they attempted to drive home from Marburg. The United States had elected to stay firmly out of the fighting in 1914, with it not only happening on another continent, but with their politics being influenced by large numbers of their population who had roots on both sides of the conflict. Nevertheless, with news of German airships beginning a bombing campaign across Western Europe and even into the British Isles, and with US public opinion turning hostile to Berlin following the sinking of the Lusitania ocean liner on May 7, 1915, in which many Americans had died. By 1916, it seemed as though the question was not if America would join the war, but when. Consequently, 1916 would see the start of an American wave of mystery Zeppelin sightings, beginning on January 5th, when a witness reported seeing a mysterious light seemingly floating through the sky above the St. Croix River, on the border between Wisconsin and Missouri. However, it was not just one, but a series of incidents in New Jersey, starting just 4 days later, that set national newspapers into a frenzy that Zeppelins were attacking the United States. On January 10, 1916, glass windows at a munitions factory in Carneys Point were mysteriously smashed, as though from some outside force. In the days that followed, 2 more factories in the area were rocked by mysterious rumblings, likened to that of bombs detonating nearby. While in between these incidents, residents spotted mysterious lights in the sky and reported sounds they likened to that of an engine occupying them. They also reported menacing black aircraft cruising above their towns during the daytime. Obviously, the question was raised over German saboteurs, but no evidence has been uncovered, and it is likely that these incidents were in fact the result of unregistered seismic activity, or simply a coincidence, as factories worked overtime to meet the demands of the war effort, leading to exhausted or stressed workers cutting corners to maintain output. As for the sightings that followed, again no evidence has been forthcoming, and so could likely be the result of hysteria. In an effort to settle public fears, authorities tried to cover up such incidents, but it was to no avail, and the word eventually got out. Sightings persisted into February across the United States. On Valentine's Day, the citizens of Laurel, Delaware, were treated to the sight of an apparent docking of 2 mysterious airships as they observed 2 airborne lights merge together. The sightings reached their peak by the end of February, before skepticism began to overpower the public mindset, as some simple explanations for many of the sightings were revealed, and nerves began to calm. Nonetheless, sightings did persist, and even included several landings, such as the one reported in April 1916 by a caretaker's son on Pine Island in Florida. The young lad reported seeing an airship having landed, and its 2 crew, who wore thick, padded clothing and goggles, ordered him to keep his distance. Given these details, it is likely, in this case at least, that the boy did actually see an American airship having landed for repairs, or to avoid some bad weather. America's airship panic had largely died out by 1917, when the US finally did enter the war on April 6, 1917. Nevertheless, mystery aircraft still continued to be sighted until the end of the war, still being called Zeppelins at least until the 1950s, when they were reclassified by researchers as UFOs. Indeed, similarly in Europe, The airship scare had largely subsided, as British and French fighter plane technology had now surpassed the performance of these mighty airships, making Zeppelin raids almost suicidal. As such, people stopped scouring the skies for their menacing cigar shape, instead looking for the first German strategic bombers such as the Gotha GV. Concurrently, the hysteria died down, leading to a dramatic fall in reported sightings. But while the airship scare of the 1910s has been largely dismissed as the result of war nerves and sensationalist, perhaps even irresponsible journalism, those interested in studying the UFO phenomenon point out that several sightings in this time, including the Sheerness Sighting, have yet to be adequately explained away, and in that case especially, was not the result of the fear of the Zeppelins, but rather what triggered it. Regardless of the true origins of the Sheerness Sighting, the real lesson to be learned from everything that came after is how we are still guided by our fears, and how that fear can manipulate how we perceive reality. Who really knows what the cause of some of the more unexplainable sightings leading up to and during the war really were? But what we can be sure of is that, intentional or not, these left a lasting impression. For who can really say whether these sightings were simply a trick of the eye or something more sinister? And so, with that in mind, trick or treat.